Okay, while Geneva is trying to fix the technical issue, I posted a question for you in the chat because I was curious and I'm interested in what particular interest in standards and standard settings brought you here today. And I have one answer which says it's consequences. I'm not sure what that means, but I'd like to hear more. So what is the particular interest that brought you here today for our participants? Yes, I mean, Asif says to learn more about standards, and that's something we definitely will accomplish today. And he says especially the Common Alerting Protocol, CAP. I'm not familiar with that, but maybe our speaker. And Asif also adds like the negotiations, and I think that's really important because on the one hand we have the standards, on the other hand we have the process that gets us to arrive at the standard. Okay, and then also another question for our participants would be, so I asked, what brings you to the webinar? Is anyone with us today who already has experience with standard setting, negotiating for standards, or applying standards? That would also be really interesting. So Miguel joined us and says, I follow the ITU and other technical organizations, and he's particularly interested in the consequences that standards have on a daily basis for the daily working life. And I very much agree, and I think we will tackle both of these issues, the kind of very mundane everyday life where standards impact, but also the kind of political process, international organizations. Oh, interesting. Elliot speaks about de jure and de facto standards. That's interesting. I mean, I know the concept from international relations, but I'm not sure about the context in terms of standards. So maybe that's something we can discuss with Lorenza later on, because that sounds really interesting. Thanks. Okay, so we have a question from Ambassador Kishan Rana, who is a senior fellow with DiploFoundation and an Indian diplomat. And so his question is, what does the topic of the web debate today actually mean? So the topic for today is standards, practical solutions for strained negotiations, or an arena of realpolitik. And it's a very good question. And I already had some exchange with our speaker about this. So the point, the general theme is that standards as such seem like a very neutral thing. Like something that facilitates our daily life greatly, that facilitates economic exchanges greatly. And as such, it seems like a neutral thing that is guided by rationality and logic, and seems, as far as I understand, because I'm not the expert, we have Lorenza with us, who will tell us more, but as far as I understand, something that just helps to run life more smoothly, both in an individual daily basis as well as on a larger economic scale. But then the question is, are standards really that neutral? And this is where the second part of the topic comes in, an arena for realpolitik, because obviously standard setting requires negotiation. And as such, there is an exchange of interests, and some interests might prevail over others. And once a standard is set, some actors might have to change their position, might have to change the way they're doing things, which has costs, economic costs, for example. So in a sense, my understanding is when you negotiate a standard, some interests might win over others, which might make the negotiation of standards actually something that is very political and potentially really tense, despite how standards might seem quite neutral and quite logical and easy to agree on. And this is why we have invited our speaker to give us more details on that. Let me see if there are any other comments or questions. Kishan, I hope this kind of answered your question. I mean, keeping in mind that I'm here to moderate and to facilitate a discussion from Lorenza, but this is what we discussed with her and in the Diplo team as a really interesting point that sometimes is forgotten when we talk about standards. So we have a comment from Sonia Morales. She says, I'm recently responsible for a partnership alliance and I'll have to get into what is called constructive dialogues. which is the way we call it instead of lobbying. And I have the impression that we get stuck in concepts but not being operative. It's a very, very important comment. My impression is that standards can facilitate this kind of working from the conceptual to the very practical. So another comment from Ambassador Kishan Rana. He says, my apprehension is that standards will be set by rich Western states alone. I think that's a very good point, and again, it kind of really speaks to the topic of the debate that it might be an arena for realpolitik. We have a comment from Miguel Candia. He says, the way I see it, standards allow us to have a certain pre-visibility, whereas realpolitik normally tends to deal with decision-making more unpredictably. Also, a very important comment from Elliot Christian. I hope I pronounce this correctly. He says his impression is that standards are pretty easy to establish, but then the uptake, so implementation following through, might actually add complications. And with my limited experience with standards, I very much agree that, as in all negotiations, I guess, the agreement is one step, the actual following through, the actual implementation is the other step. Oh, another interesting comment from Elliot, who says, and here he agrees with Sonia Morales, the tension seems to be between academic participants and operational participants. Okay, we have an interesting question from Ryan Daibes. That's how I would pronounce your name. I'm really sorry, it's probably not how you pronounce your name, but the question is very important for us here. You say, can we start by defining realpolitik, as we tend to hear different definitions, interpretations. What I would like to suggest here is basically realpolitik in the very simple sense of an exchange of different interests where power comes into play. So in the sense that negotiations for standards are an aspect where power comes into play, and that's what we need to look at. Power as in, similar to the comment by Ambassador Rana, that more powerful states or more powerful actors in the negotiation might be more able to set the agenda and to influence how the standard is eventually set. So that's what we mean by realpolitik in a very simple definition of the term. And I see our speaker nodding, so that is good. Good. So this about realpolitik. And then a very important comment from Miguel Candia. He says, the multi-stakeholder approach and the multilateral discussions are a way to avoid having standards set by a group of countries. And again, a very important comment. From my personal experience, I look a lot at the Sustainable Development Goals, and the process of arriving at the Sustainable Development Goals is very much guided by this multi-stakeholder approach, exactly to kind of counteract the idea that certain countries or a certain group of countries dominate the agenda or set the agenda. Obviously, we need to ask to what extent was this approach successful. However, with the SDGs, we've seen the first global attempt to really bring the multi-stakeholder model into setting goals for the whole world, in setting the global goals. So in general here, I agree with you. But again, I think we need to look at the details. And I hope our speaker will be able to speak to that more specifically. Another very useful comment from Elliot, who again speaks to this idea of realpolitik and certain countries dominating the agenda or dominating the debate, in this case, especially countries from the West. What he adds here is, he says, my feeling is that the uptake on standards is driven by rich international companies. From what I've understood so far from my conversations with Lorenza is that standards play a very important part in managing economic relations and managing the smooth running of economic relations and exchanges internationally. And if we speak about a multi-stakeholder model and non-state actors, international corporations are, of course, a big player and, of course, have a vested interest in influencing the setting of standards. So I entirely agree, but our speaker will be able to add more depth to this. Okay, I think our speaker just changed computers. So I hope with a new computer comes new luck as she joins us again. Hello, Lorenza, good to see you again. I can't hear you yet, but we will manage. Oh, Asif says he appreciated the comments on the multi-stakeholder model and the sustainable development.
Yes, now it should really be working, in fact. No? It is. Yes. Great.
Yes,
Excellent. So thank you very much for this introduction and for taking us through these first few comments. And there was one comment that I would like to start from in really starting the talk today, and it is, what is realpolitik? And you answered by saying that's how the interest of different players, and particularly of big players, enter the negotiating room, both in intergovernmental negotiations and in standards negotiations. And I think that's the idea that we're trying to develop today. How do standards help in offering solutions to this kind of setting? And this setting will remain there, whether we're talking in the standard setting body or if we're talking in an intergovernmental setting. The reality of big interests playing into the development of the standard cannot be somehow resolved by fiat. And it is a question that will be present at each and every negotiating table that you will enter. Now, how do standards offer a solution to that? And I think we cannot just talk in general. We really need to look at examples and how these tensions were resolved in practice in different different negotiations in both settings. So with that, I'd like to say a few words about how standards are developed. Yes, I'm sorry, I'm not very familiar with this. Yes, maybe. Yeah. So my plan, we're a bit behind schedule, but was to give some basic facts about how standards are developed and how they're used and why they matter for the SDGs, which is an important area in which standards are used and can be used further. And then I will offer you some examples of how standards have resulted from the opposition of entrenched interest, but have been able to offer solutions that have offered a mediation between these interests. And standards also as practical solutions for the SDGs and other regulatory frameworks. So what are standards? A standard is simply defined as an agreed way of doing something, and this something can be a product. Then the standard will define the desired characteristic of a product. For example, what characteristics does a product need to have in order to be safe, in order, for example, to be interoperable with other devices, in order to be, for example, of the desired quality. And there are many different characteristics that we can define in a product, and standards will help us to give us specification regarding those. And the same is true of services, and more we have standards that relate to service provisions as well. And finally, standards will help us define a process. So how does a company or a service provider go about their business? So there are standards, for example, that relate to the quality of the production process. There are standards that relate to the environmental aspects of the production process, so that will help a company monitor their impact on the environment or their use of energy or their emissions, and many other aspects of the production process. And these are just a few examples. There are thousands and thousands of standards, so it would be difficult to offer a categorization that will be doing justice to them all. But yeah, let's stick to our definition, a great way of doing something. And how are they useful in our day-to-day life? We can just think of our morning routine. We wake up thanks to an alarm clock. The alarm clock has been built according to standards. Not only that, but there is a standard for the setting of time, and it's thanks to that standard that our clocks in our wristwatches, but also on our mobiles, are synchronized and ensure that we're awake at the right time. And then for those of us who use contact lenses, we will go and wear those, and they have been preserved during the night in a solution that has been prepared according to standards. And our contact lenses themselves will have been built according to standards. So we're not even half awake, and we've used a palette of standards already. If we go out jogging before we start our day, our shoes will have been not only built according to standards, but also tested according to standards. And as we take our different means of transportations to come to the office, be it a bike, be it a metro, be it a tram, all of these systems of transportations will have been developed according to standards. And so will all our devices that we use to prepare breakfast and to just getting ready for our morning. And that is just a small slice in our day. And that's just to say that standards really define everyday life. And that's something that came out in the comments already. And I had a short video, which I also played for you in the last webinar that I animated. And I'd like to show it to you again just for a minute, if technology helps us here. Or less than. Yes, now it does. No, it doesn't want to work. But anyway, it was just an example of how standards really inform different aspects of our lives. So in this example, it was about sunscreen and how standards define the characteristics of this particular product, which are helping us manage our daily lives. And then I would like to then move on to more closely to the subject of today.
Okay, in the meantime, to give the Geneva office and to give our speaker some time to reconnect, I'd like to share my favorite example. So, I mean, we just heard from our speaker that standards are part of daily life. Like when she was explaining, we wake up in the morning and every little step we take is guided by standards. My favorite example, which kind of expands this idea of standards to regulations and indicators as well, comes from the Sustainable Development Goals, which is one of my main interests these days in terms of my research. And so the example I have is related to the indicator framework for the Sustainable Development Goals. So the Sustainable Development Goals were agreed upon in 2015. There was a very long consultation process. We know that the consultation process was a multi-stakeholder process, so try to involve all stakeholders, try to give everyone a say in agreeing on the global goals. So now that we have the global goals, the next step was to find an indicator framework for the Sustainable Development Goals. In that sense, the idea was, if you're pushing for the next stage in global development, we need to find a way of measuring that next stage in global development. And we need to measure where we are now, and then we need to measure in order to mark the progress until 2030, when the global goals, when the Sustainable Development Goals are meant to be accomplished. So far, so good. However, I think the agreeing on the indicator framework for the Sustainable Development Goals is another example where something that seems quite natural and quite obvious, such as an indicator or a standard, can actually be something that undergoes intense negotiations between very different interests. So what I'm particularly interested in is the indicators for SDG 4. SDG 4 calls for quality education. And as such, if we're interested in finding an indicator for SDG 4, we need to find a definition of quality education.
Yes, I am indeed. I'm sorry, it's a particular challenge today technologically, it seems. And I'm sorry I missed what you were saying, but I was going to show how standards have helped in the past balancing different interests in different negotiations, starting from one of the earliest standards set by ISO, the International Standardization Organization, as regards containers. And containers really, today we take them for granted, but revolutionized international trade and were a pillar of globalization. And indeed, we couldn't think of international trade as we know it today without containers. And during the first years of containerization, there were a number of different sizes of containers adopted, and they were incompatible with one another. And then, as the standard was developed within ISO, it was very difficult to find a consensus between different competing interests across the table, between Europe and the United States, and also the sentiment that developing countries were left out of the negotiations, and their interests were not satisfactorily taken into account. And that was one of the factors that certainly made the negotiations also particularly difficult back then. And finally, an agreement was reached. And in this case, the compromise which was found was that there was provision for different lengths of containers. And not only that, but also an exception was made for inland containers that were mostly used in Europe. So that's an interesting example, in my opinion, because it shows how at times technical solutions enter the political debate and offer a way forward, which can be in the form of allowing for flexibility between different specifications, and also different specifications being used in different areas of international trade. So that I thought was a good example. And as things move forward, there's still quite a lot of standards being set in the area of containerization. But as things moved forward, the debate certainly moved on from those initial oppositions onto different and more technical subjects that are debated now as regards, for example, the flooring of the containers and other aspects that are going to be more into the operationalization of this technology. And I'll move on and give a second example. Another example where a solution was found between competing interests, and that was in the setting of ISO 14000, which is a standard that allows companies to manage their environmental responsibilities. The interest for standardization in this area was compounded by a number of large-scale accidents and chemical accidents in particular that were prominently affecting the lives of consumers and citizens, especially in Europe in the 80s. So standards came to follow on the concerns expressed by consumers, but also by the increasing use by companies of different environmental specifications, not only on their premises, but also in their relations with their suppliers and their first tier and second tier and third tier suppliers also. And the concern that all of these environmental measures were resulting in a substantial increase in non-tariff barriers to trade. So at that time, we had both UN conferences and WTO negotiations ongoing, and which reinforced both the reality of the requests by consumers, by citizens, of enhanced protection for the environment as a desirable policy objective, and also the preoccupation that these would result in barriers to trade. All of that resulted in a strong demand for standardization and international standardization in this area. So we move on to the negotiations, which resulted ultimately in the development of ISO 14000. And again, the interests that were opposing one another on different negotiation tables reproduce themselves in the technical committee, because these are interests that will have to emerge and will have to be discussed. But what I'm trying to show is that what happens when you change the table, you change into some more operational aspects, and these aspects are lend themselves to finding solutions that then can be implemented on the ground and can provide a way forward from sterile negotiations onto practical action. And in this case, of course, in the committee, as you look at the history of the committee, you will see that there were powerful interests represented, but also interests from consumers, from citizens, from NGOs, from CSOs, from governments that were opposing that. And the result has been a standard that has been overwhelmingly beneficial for the environment at a global level. Then I don't know how much time we want to devote more to the presentation, but just to say that the SDGs are one of the aspects of what we call the post-2015 development agenda, which is a very rich set of documents which were adopted in 2015 and 2016 as well, which was a historic year for the United Nations with the adoption of a framework for disaster risk reduction, of a framework for financing for sustainable development, that was the Addis Ababa document, and then the adoption of the SDGs and the adoption of the Paris Agreement, followed then in 2016 by the adoption of the New Urban Agenda. So it's a very rich set of commitments that will guide development action for the next 15 years. And how can standards offer solutions that will allow us to move beyond contrapositions and on to actions? And I think there's a number of examples of those. First and foremost, because challenges but also desired objectives are becoming global, and we need cohesive and coherent solutions at international level. We need to involve business, because governments surely do not have the means to solve all the challenges that are before us, so we need to enlist business in moving forward, and standards allow us to speak the language of business, so allow us to really enlist the cooperation of business in moving this agenda forward. Also, standards help us move forward a good regulatory practice and create economies of scale, and help us bring innovation onto the factory floor, not just in developed countries, but in developing countries, in SMEs, because they embed solutions that can be readily applied in any setting. Of course, we need to do more as regards empowering developing countries, SMEs, consumers, also women, also disadvantaged group, in having a voice in the standards development process, and that's an important challenge. We will not be able to use standards for the SDGs unless we're able to have standards that are really inclusive and that represent the interests of all involved. And I think that's an important agenda, and it's an agenda that the UN should pursue further in collaboration with the standards bodies, so that we do not have a competing agenda, but we're all working to the same direction. I think the SDGs offer some important solutions for a number of the different SDGs. When you think of clean energy, there are standards for electrification, there are standards for wind turbines, there are standards for smart grids, among others. So there's quite a rich palette of standards that will help us move that. For the environmental goals on climate action, life below water, life on land, we talked about the ISO 14000 family, but also the ISO 50000 family on energy management will provide important solutions. And obviously, when we think of the Partnership for the Goals, and particularly international trade, certainly standards have a lot to offer. And that was recognized, and the role that standards can play for the different agreements that were signed in 2015 and 16 was certainly recognized. And I just wanted to make one example, and then I'll take some questions because we're really short of time. I just wanted to offer the example of the standards body of Morocco, Imanor. We participated at the COP22 in Marrakesh and showcased real examples of how voluntary standards can be used to advance sustainable development. And they also specifically called attention to how the consensual, inclusive nature of standards can respond to the needs and to the aspirations of different countries, so that they are taken into account when we sign conventions and agreements. And they were citing projects that were led by ISO and also by other standards organizations in the MENA region, just as one example, in different areas, including CSR, energy, water, the environment. Again, another example of how we can move forward in negotiations and move from debate to solutions that are practical and that can be applied by all actors, including the most disadvantaged ones. So I'll stop here for my presentation. I'm glad to take questions. There are quite a lot of good questions already.
Thank you, Lorenza, and thank you for battling the technological issues together with us. One question from the audience concerns how do you agree on standards in a conflict situation? So if the negotiation is very conflictual.
Yes, the examples that I made really, I think, show convincingly that it is possible to find consensus. And in the technical committees where I participate, it's inevitable that big interests play out, and it's inevitable that the chairperson and the secretariat need to be paying particular care that due process is followed. And the consensus process within standardization provides an important guarantee for the impartiality of the resulting standard.
Yeah, that's really helpful. I was also wondering, towards the end of your presentation, you talked about two standard families, ISO 5000 and I think ISO 14000, and the relation to the SDGs. So I'm wondering if you could elaborate a bit more. I'm particularly interested in the question of these standards existed prior to the SDGs, and then the SDGs are drawing on them, or what is the process there? Or is there even now an impetus for deepening these standards or making them, I don't know, making them broader or applicable to more issues?
Yes, certainly there are some standards that were pre-existing. Standards are have a shelf life like many other products, and so typically under the ISO, for example, after 5 years, they are mandatory revision of standards. So that will allow for integrating even more the SDG perspective into the standards for which this is relevant. But this will be embedded in standards that already exist. For example, what the standard that I was quoting before, ISO 14000, has been already applied in the real world, and there are more than 300,000 certificates already, and 12,000 already for 50,001 on energy management systems. So that's a good basis for building up on good practice for environmental engagement by the corporate sector, and also by government administrations in many countries that use these standards in their own operations, or for example to fund or for example to select among procurement options. And as well, there's going to be, as you say, the potential to set standards that will help us advance on the SDGs. And one example is 14,080 on greenhouse gas management. So that will have a potential to be used for climate negotiations and for the implementation of the Paris Agreement.
Yeah, thank you. There are a couple more questions on the SDGs, which I'm going to bring in a second. But there's a comment and question from Noha, Noha Fati, which I would like to read. So I understand that standards are important as they support innovation, unified objectives, and hence better impact. However, we can't always assume that a set of standards are ideal. Maybe by time and experience, certain standards would prove not to be adequate, or some standards could prove not to be fair for some, and sometimes even for many. So my question here, can standards, particularly international ones, be challenged, altered? How, and if there are examples?
Yes, absolutely, and they are indeed revised, and there's a process how they are revised so that they continue to respond to the interest of all stakeholders. It's also true that standards will prove that their worth when they are on the market. So standards that do not respond to the interest of the stakeholders will simply not be taken up. And it's true, and I think this was a comment that was made earlier on in the debate, that the trick is not so much in the making of the standards, but really in the uptake and the implementation. So, for example, the standards that we were discussing before, the fact that there are 300,000 certificates shows that the standard has been valued by the market, and when standards do not meet the expectations, they will remain in the drawer. And when I say 300,000 certificates, I'm just looking at those organizations that went through with the whole process. But there's a lot more organizations that will not go all the way to certification, but will still use the standard in informing their processes and in structuring their operations. But they will choose not to ask for certification because, for example, that is a very costly procedure, or because they cannot, for different reasons that may be also statutory, seek an independent third-party certification. So the influence that these standards have made worldwide is certainly a lot bigger than those certificates numbers would suggest.
Yes, there are basically two questions on the SDGs. One, what is the role of multi-stakeholders in implementation of the SDGs and standards? And I guess here standards related to the SDGs. And then that was from Asif, and then Miguel Candilla, in regards to the SDG and taking into account previous experiences such as the.
Yes, it's a very good question, and definitely when we go out and measure the implementation and to measure the implementation of the SDGs and how far we've been able to respond to this set of targets and ambitions, standards have a huge potential to offer. I think it has been taken up to a level, and it could have been taken up a lot more. But I don't know if the negotiators are sufficiently aware of the potential of standards in implementing the SDG agenda. At the same time, whether or not we're able to have a real reference to standards in the indicators, what remains important is that the SDGs provide an umbrella, and they provide a direction for action. And so what is important is what countries are doing, what companies are doing, what administrations are doing. And whether or not we have them referenced in the indicators, still they are shaping the strategies that allow us to achieve the SDGs. And as regards the role of stakeholders, again, I think that's part of the same question, really, that what we need is concrete actions that allows us to implement workable solutions for climate change, for the reduction of emissions, for the reduction of energy use, and for the shifting to a more sustainable path of development. And in all of these areas, clearly, we see a palette of standards that are playing an important role.
Yeah, thank you. I think what really struck me when you were elaborating was the question: are the people who work on the SDGs, on their implementation, or who were participants in the negotiation, are they actually aware of the standards? And if to what extent would greater awareness actually facilitate the negotiation and will actually facilitate the implementation? So in this sense, I very much read this as a call for awareness raising with regard to existing standards. Which I think is a really important point. One of the comments asked me to provide basically some closure, because when you had the technical problems, I started elaborating on an example which was related to the indicator framework for the SDGs. So I think what is important is to stress that when we talk about indicators for the SDGs, that is different from standards. Yet, in order to provide measurability, the SDGs were also looking for an indicator framework. And the example I used was SDG 4 on education, and Sustainable Development Goal 4 calls for quality education. And then one of the questions was, how do we operationalize quality education? How do we find an indicator for quality education? And in order to find indicators for the SDG, there was a whole process set up to do this, which was called the Interagency Expert Group on the SDGs. It was very much a multi-stakeholder process, something we already mentioned in the discussion. And the indicator that was eventually chosen to measure quality education is the following: the percentage of children and young people at the end of each level of education achieving at least a minimum proficiency level in A, reading, and B, mathematics. So we had something very amorphous and very lofty, the goal for quality in education, which was then translated into numeracy and literacy skills. The interesting thing here is that the multi-stakeholder process that led to the discussion, that was part of the discussion, was very critical of that. There were calls for greater diversity, there were calls for including values and ethics and social responsibility, for including broader learning outcomes, or for being very much aware of the special needs of marginalized communities, indigenous people, and indigenous languages. Now we have an indicator that is very very general, and it was very interesting to basically follow this process. So this is just to kind of close the debate I started when you had technical problems, and again just stressing that this is an indicator which is different from a standard, but following this process of how do we operationalize something like quality education, and what is the debate around that. That was a very interesting example.
I'm thinking about the dominance of business interests, which, as I was saying, is a reality, and we cannot hide away from that.
No, we don't have any sound. I'm so sorry.
It's better without the mic. And yeah, no, I was saying that unfortunately you see that standards are sometimes set as de facto standards by the prominence of one company or another on the market as the dominant player. And I think there were some very good examples that were shared by some of the comments here. And that's really what we'd like to avoid by having standards set through a transparent and consensus building process in a standards body that really avoids having one interest prevailing on all others. But I think that those are outcomes that at times have been the result of the market processes.
I think we can use this as a very excellent conclusion, calling for greater transparency among others. So let me conclude here. First of all, thank you very much for our participants who spent this hour with us. But most importantly, thank you so much for our speaker, Ms. Lorenza Jachia, who stuck with us through quite a number of technical problems, which was also a first for us. Thank you so much for being with us and for elaborating more on standards and really driving the debate a bit forwards, especially in relation to the SDGs, especially in relation to power politics and realpolitik and the kind of negotiation process that goes on with standards. So thank you so much. Let us conclude here. Our next web debate will take place on June 6th, again, the first Tuesday of the month at 1 p.m. CST. And thank you again. Thank you so much. We will follow up with a blog summarizing the topics of the debate, and we can certainly stay in touch on these issues. Thank you, Lorenza. Thank you. Bye. Thank you for participating. Bye, everyone. See you next time.